This overview is mainly Europe and the Mediterranean from the Bronze Age into the 18th century. In that world, the sword was one of history's longest lived hand weapons, but it is easy to overstate its battlefield role. In many periods, it was the backup or follow-up weapon rather than the first thing to strike. Since hoplites relied first on the spear, Roman legionnaires on javelins before closing in with the gladius, and medieval knights on the lance before turning to the sword. The timeline. The long history begins in the Bronze Age, when swords became distinct from daggers. Britannica places the separation in the 3rd millennium BCE, with long coppers and bronze leaf-shaped blades and early integral hilts. In Middle Bronze Age Europe, surviving swords show cast bronze construction, sometimes made in separate blade and grip elements riveted together. By Classical Greece, straight short swords existed alongside curved blades, such as the machaira, whose form was suited for delivering strong, descending cuts. Rome then made the gladius, famous as a short, cut-and-thrust oriented sword, for the longer spatha replaced it in the later empire. In the early Middle Ages, the European sword became a highly prestigious warrior weapon. Viking Age examples often use pattern-welded blades and richly decorated hilts, and surviving museum pieces strongly suggest elite ownership. By the High and late Middle Ages, the familiar cruciform knightly sword dominated, straight, double-edged, worn with mail and then plate. Built around a guard and pommel that gave the weapon balance. The basic knightly form changed surprisingly little between about the 12 and 1500s. Later in the 14th and 15th centuries, longer hand-and-a-half swords became important, especially as armor improved and the point mattered more. In the early modern period, swords diverged instead of disappearing. The rapier became the principal civilian sidearm of the 16th and 17th century, emphasizing point work and hand protection. By about 1700s, the rapier had slimmed into the small sword, a lighter thrusting weapon that doubled as a gentlemanly dress. At the same time, curved blades remained important. While curved saber traditions were already long established in Asia and the Islamic world and later shaped European sabers as cavalry weapons. Firearms eventually pushed swords out of their central military role, but not immediately. Instead, they multiplied into civilian, dueling, cavalry, and ceremonial forms. The parts. At the simplest level, a sword is a blade plus hilt. On the blade, the important features are the point, edge, or edges, and often one or more fullers, the grooves sometimes wrongly called blood grooves. A fuller's real function is to reduce mass without sacrificing strength or flexibility. Some later swords also have a ricasso, an unsharpened section near the hilt. The hilt includes the guard or cross, often with quillins, the grip, and the pommel. The pommel is not just decorative. It helps keep the hand from sliding off and acts as a counterweight, making the sword feel balanced. The tang of the blade passes up into the hilt and pommel assembly. Blade types and sword families. The easiest way to understand sword history is by blade purpose. Broad, straight, double-edged blades like the gladius, or many medieval knightly swords, are generally purposely cut and thrust-oriented weapons. Some medieval blades with rounded tips lean more towards cutting, though they can still thrust. Narrow and stiffer blades shift towards the point. Late hand-and-a-half swords, astocks, and rapiers all show that trend, with the astock built especially to attack mail or the gaps in between the plates. Curved blades answer a different problem. The Greek machaira was shaped for a strong overhead blow. The European falchion is one of the important medieval curved family, and later sabers favored slicing and draw cutting, especially in mounted use. The Metropolitan Museum's Swift saber even combines a curved blade with a grip long enough for two hands, showing that sword types rarely fit into perfectly neat boxes. So the name sword families was most remembering are these: Bronze Age leaf swords, Greek short swords, and machaira, Roman gladius and spatha, Viking swords, the medieval arming/knightly sword, hand and a half swords, falchions, astocks, rapiers, small swords, long swords, and sabers. The names change, but the underlying design questions stay the same. How much reach, how much hand protection, and whether the blade favors cutting, thrusting, or both. The oak-shot typology is a way to define and catalog the medieval sword based on physical form. It categorizes swords of the European Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 16th centuries, into 13 main types, labeled X through XXYY. A sword's edge is the whole point of its being. The entire design of the blade, shape, dynamics, hilt form, and construction are all about creating a tool to deliver the edge and point of a sword to its target. In this post, we'll lay out a few considering to achieve the most desirable edge geometry for your sword. The edge of the sword is where the two planes of the blade meet. This can be a variety of shapes and angles, depending on the intended use of the sword and the skill of the person who last worked on owning the edge. Most medieval and Renaissance European swords are double-edged and more or less laterally symmetrical. In this type of sword, the planes that diverge from the thickest portion of the blade and taper down to the edge may be called the primary bevel. This bevel may begin at the central edge of the sword, or it may begin to outside of the fuller or fullers. This initial reduction in blade thickness as it approaches the edge is one of the most primary factors that can influence the blade's cutting ability as well as its durability. Simply put, the thinner blade is in profile, the more efficiently it is when it comes to slitting through the target. However, thinner blades are more easily damaged when they encounter an unyielding target. All of these different edges, geometries, and blade profiles are an attempt at balancing a useful edge with a sufficiently sturdy blade to carry out its function. For example, a razor blade cuts very well, but if mounted on a pole and swung at a target, it is unlikely to survive the encounter undamaged. Instead, it will bend or break, and the edge will chip or roll. This is why razors, while very sharp, do not make a very good edge geometry for swords. The issue is of a particular concern for swords, which are designed to deliver an effective attack with the edge or point against a target which may or may not be armored. We are thus confronted with the reality that there is no all-around best sword for all purposes. No all-around best edge, no all-around best blade. Rather, a competent sword user of the period who would have used the right tool for the job based on the perceived advantage of a particular style of fighting against a particular type of target, and in a particular context if they have the choice. This is an important concept to grasp when studying the use of the swords, as it explains the variation we see in sword edges. When looking at the edge, one of the most define what makes sharp. The edge of sword blade is the meeting of two planes. Many knives are ground to 22.5% angle, which is sometimes referred to as the most efficient edge bevel. But simply reading any internet forum on edge geometry and primary and secondary bevels will tell you that there is far more conspicuous on the issue. The materials and making. The material history with copper and bronze then shifts into iron and steel. Bronze Age European swords were cast weapons. Later swords were forged. Viking blades could be a pattern welded, made from iron, intertwined rods of iron and steel to create a blade that was both tough and resilient. By the rapier era, the blade itself was routinely steel, and maker's mark point to major production centers such as Toledo and Zolliken. A sword was rarely the work of only one craftsperson. Even when the blade was the star, the finished object might involve the bladesmith, the cutler or hilt maker, and the scabbard maker. By the small sword period, the Metropolitan Museum explains the best examples as combining the crafts of the swordsmith, the cutler, and the jeweler. usage, and effectiveness. A sword's great strength is versatility. It can cut, thrust, parry, and be worn conveniently at the belt. That made it ideal as a sidearm and a personal weapon. Its biggest weakness is reach. Spear, pike, lance, and polearms usually hit first. That is why hoplites, legionnaires, and knights all are paired with swords with longer primary weapons. Against lightly armored opponents, swords were extremely dangerous. Real historical swords were sophisticated, efficient weapons in trained hands, not crude iron bars. But armor changes what effective meant. A broad-cut thrust sword works very well in general combat. Once heavy armor becomes common, sword design shifts more towards stiffer, sharper points. A late medieval hand-and-a-half sword is described as primary for thrusting to pierce armor, and its S-stock is even more explicit. A stiff armor-piercing thrusting blade for attacking mail are the gaps in plate. Rapiers go still further toward refined point work for unarmored civilian fencing and self-defense. Who used them? Almost everyone used swords at some point, not done in the same way. Greek infantry carried them beside a spear. Roman legionnaires closed with the gladius after the missile weapons. Early medieval swords could be high-status warrior possessions. Medieval Europe treated the sword as the classic weapon of the knights and mounted men-at-arms. And early modern Europe turned the rapier into the small sword, into civilian gentleman's sidearm. Social rules mattered too. In medieval Europe, the right to wear a sword in public varied place and period, and that peacetime swords were often restricted to noblemen, with peasants and burghers barred from carrying them. Later social change loosened that pattern, making rapiers and small swords normal wear for gentlemen. So a sword was always more than a weapon. It was also a badge of status, class, office, and masculine identity. Weight and handling. Popular culture badly exaggerates sword weight. Germany in medieval and Renaissance single-handed swords usually averaged about 1 to 2 kilograms, while even a large two-handed war swords rarely exceeded 4.5 kilograms. Balance mattered as much as raw weight, which is exactly why pommels exist. Maintenance. Historically, swords were a constant maintenance problem. Steel rusts, sweat and fingerprints attack the surface, and organic parts, wood grips, leather coverings, textile wraps, and scabbards shrink, tear, rot, or detach. Modern royal armories, conversations guides still emphasizes keeping swords in a stable, dry environment, using light protective oil or wax, and avoiding careless handling. That advice matches what museum objects show. Rust-pitted blades, scabbard, seams pulling away, rust staining on coverings, and grips that have disintegrated and needed replacement. Some excavated swords are so corroded that parts of the scabbard have effectively fused to the blade. As a closure, plus some iconic swords of history. If armor were about layers of defense, the sword is about trade-offs in offense. Broad, straight blades give general purpose cut and thrust utility. Narrow, stiff points answer armor. Curved blades favor slicing power, often in mounted or specialized fighting. Across all those changes, the sword remained more than just a sharpened steel. It was a balanced, composite tool, a sidearm, a prestigious object, and eventually a civilian badge of rank and fashion. It declined as a battlefield weapon, not because it suddenly stopped working, but because changes in armor, tactics, polearms, and firearms changed what soldiers most needed for a personal weapon.